And Heather McPherson, welcome, and thank you for coming here. You know, listening to this, I have to ask you a question that isn't on the theme. This is your first term in Parliament, correct?
It is, yes.
Did it surprise you that they can't seem to get anything done?
I assume you're talking about C10.
Well, I'm talking about just, you know, you name it. It seems to be so difficult to, every one of you in some ways agrees on what you want for our sector. But
so
it just doesn't seem to be able to get done. And now when I see all these mandate reviews that are being proposed of the CRTC, the CBC, et cetera, I just wonder whether we will have time to take advantage of the opportunity that we have in a world that's crying out for content creation. Will we ever be able to get a kind of realistic proposal that all parties will agree to?
Well, it's a great question. And first of all, I want to thank you all for letting me join you today. I'm on Treaty 6 territory, and it's a delight to be here. It's nice to be here with my colleagues from the Heritage Committee. I can answer the question writ large. As a new parliamentarian, I can say that this was a unique parliament to be elected into, of course. With COVID-19, the fact that we were able to get supports out so fast to people, the fact that we were able to, I'm the deputy House leader in addition to being the deputy heritage critic, and the supports we were able to get out was really quite rapid. I was really proud of what the NDP was able to do to ensure that some of those supports went out to Canadians. So on one hand, I think in 2020, we saw the best of what government can be when it works together, and when we collaborate and when we all pull in the same direction, and when the goal is to help Canadians. The goal is to make sure all Canadians prosper and can succeed and can be safe and healthy and productive. So that's the best case scenario. And so I'm really happy I can start with the positive. The other scenario, of course, we alluded to it a lot in this conversation so far. It was on C10, and it was unbelievably stressful and unbelievably disappointing. I'm a highly impatient person by nature. I don't know if it's my Scottish heritage or what makes me that way, but I found I would spend so many days speaking to people within the sector, to speaking with people within the broadcasting sector that, small, medium creators, the broadcasters themselves, the small radio stations in different areas of the country. And the one thing we heard from everyone is that the legislation that was brought forward, the C10, needed to be fixed, and that it was so late and so delayed, and that they would rather have flawed legislation than no legislation, because we were so late to the game getting something together. So knowing that there was this urgency, knowing that there was this dire need for the sector, of course, it's incredibly disappointing to see that ultimately C10 died, that it was not brought forward soon enough. It was brought forward in November, and certainly I worked as hard as I could, and we sat extra hours, and we tried as hard as we could to move it through the process, through committee and through the House of Commons. I do find it, I'm not going to lie, I do find it incredibly disingenuous. Kevin, you're a good friend of mine, but we all know the Conservatives did not support C10, particularly, I don't know if it was CRTC or when we actually insisted that the web giants be held to account, when we insisted that the web giants actually played on the same playing field, a level playing field. So it's very frustrating to see that. I'm happy to hear the minister say that they will be reintroducing C10 legislation within the first 100 days of the next parliament. I certainly hope that some of the important work that was done at the committee to fix C10 is incorporated into that new legislation, and that we can move it through the process very, very fast and get it to the Senate. The worst case scenario would be that we kick this can down the road for another 2 years and end up, losing it again. So I'm urging all of the parties, and I know for the New Democrats, we will do whatever we can to get this updated broadcasting legislation in place.
So one of the things that I think people think this is our best chance ever to have a thriving, creative industry that will not only do things inside the country, but we will be seen around the world. What do you think that politicians need from our sector to make things happen?
Well, I mean, I think the sector has been incredibly productive, incredibly giving with politicians. You know, I myself, as I mentioned, met with hundreds of people to talk about C10 legislation and how it could be improved. We all know that while we sat in committee, you know, and debated the amendments, the very numerous amendments that were brought forward by all five parties, including the government itself, that you know, you were all watching, you were all helping us draft those amendments and whatnot. What I valued the most about the C10 conversation is actually listening to those of you within the sector, listening to people and trying to find ways to make sure that we were doing those things that were so important, that we were leveling the playing field, you know, that we were protecting language minority rights in Quebec and outside of Quebec. You know, I'm in Edmonton, Strathcona. It is where the French Quarter in Alberta is located. We have French broadcasters in Edmonton, Strathcona that are trying to ensure that the French language across the country is protected. And I will fight tooth and nail, despite my inability to fight tooth and nail in French, for that to continue. You know, we heard from the broadcasters, we heard from the sector, and that's who we need to listen to. That's what the gift that we got from your sector, and that we'll continue to hear. And we need to take that information and make sure the legislation is better.
So your advice tonight is keep at it, keep doing it, and do it more.
Yeah, and you know what? I guess what you need to do is encourage people within your sector to recognize that elections matter, and there is one in 2 weeks. Elections matter because you need to elect somebody who will move this forward, who will fight for artists, will fight for the cultural sector, will fight for the broadcasting sector. That won't fight. You know, we don't want another situation where the web giants are allowed to get away with whatever they like. You know, when we don't hold the web giants to account, when we don't include them in our broadcasting legislation, it's the equivalent of subsidizing them. So we're subsidizing these foreign web giants at the expense of our local media, at the expense of our local broadcasters, and that's utterly wrong.
So the continuing question in the sector is why, when Canada obviously has so much talent, has such a gift of storytelling, do so many Canadians have to go to work in the United States or in England? How can you help us make that not the case?
Well, I think we need to invest in our creators. You know, we need to make sure that it is, because you're absolutely right, Trina. The stories that Canadians tell, the stories about Canadians, made by Canadian writers, Canadian producers, you know, the post-production happening in Canada is vital. And we do amazing work. You know, we all have examples of amazing production that's happened in Canada, in Alberta, you know, in each of our communities. So we already know that the capacity is there, the skill is there, the talent is there. But you're right, we have a massive neighbor next door, and we need to live with that reality. We need to invest in our sector. We need to make sure that we are investing in, you know, whether that be the National Film Board, whether that be CBC, so that they can do more of that content creation and ensure that those stories are still being told. There's a lot of different ways that we can make sure that we're promoting and working with the sector. Now, I said it with C10, and I'll say it again for this question. The most important thing is that we are listening to broadcasters and creative creators, that we are listening to writers, we are listening to producers, so that we are helping them in the way that they need to be helped, whether those are tax credits, whether that is additional investment in things like the NFB and CBC, telefilm, the media funds. You know, all of those things need to be on the table, but they need to be things that are being developed in collaboration with the sector, not separate from the sector.
So you're saying, I think, something that is very important. And think that I wanted to ask you just to go into a little more of what you said about how the institutions and the independent companies, businesses can work together. We have Telefilm, we have CBC, we have various funds and so on. And we also have, you know, profit-making companies who want to get out there and make money out of what they do. What's the relationship between those two? Or is there?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think I see that many of our institutions like CBC, Radio Canada, like the Canada Media Fund, you know, the NFB, a lot of those are great opportunities for us to tell Canadian stories, and ensure that we have the stories from our queer communities, from our BIPOC communities, from Indigenous communities, from communities whose stories may not be promoted and privileged as much. Now, I think there's ways that we can encourage the private sector to do that as well. But these are those spaces where we can ensure that that's happening, where we can really make sure that that's the case. You know, I think we have a great opportunity right now, and I really, like you, hope that we don't miss the opportunity. You know, we know COVID-19 was unbelievably hard on the broadcasting sector. It was incredibly hard on our writers, our production teams. And we also know that they were amongst the first industries to sort of feel the real cuts of it, and maybe one of the last ones to recover fully. You know, we were all very, very proud of how the industry pivoted during COVID-19 to keep Canadians safe, to keep themselves safe, to continue on with production. But I think this opportunity and time means that we should be envisioning what it looks like going forward. We have a bit of a restart button. So let's put together a arts and culture industry package, a rebuilding package that will support the industry, that will help people recover, help the industry recover from the pandemic, but will also set us up to be more modern, be more future looking. I mean, the sector itself is, our funding mechanisms are not.
Good point. Okay, Patrick.
Oui, Madame McPherson, sur la question de l'environnement, où se situe le nouveau Parti démocratique?
On the environmental question, Ms. McPherson, where does the NDP stand on that, and how could that work in order to improve things, for example, in Canada's broadcasting industry? What would you see as a measure that we could choose in order to have a more carbon neutral landscape? Would it be by tax credits, for example, or what kinds of programs would the NDP promote for audiovisual production and greening it in Canada?
Well, you know, again, I'm sorry, but I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record. I think this is another opportunity where we speak to the sector and we find those ways that will work within what the sector is doing. You know, I think that earlier on we had heard the sector has a great desire to move into an environmentally carbon neutral space. So what is the best way to do that? You know, how do we reward those productions that are being more carbon neutral and that are being more thoughtful about their impacts on the environment? What would that look like? I think that is something that you talk to the sector about and develop the strategies that way. There's another thing, though, that I think is really important, that we have an opportunity with our broadcasting sector, with our arts and culture sector, to tell stories about greening that I think we also need to be considering. You know, telling the stories about climate change, the impacts of climate change on populations, on Canadians around the country. You know, I think there's also something there to be said about, you know, the storytelling that we do, that holding that mirror up, is such an important role. It's such an important way for us to get Canadians talking about the climate crisis, get people acting on it. You know, I would love to see a credit program. I would love to see us be able to do something with the sector, but I'll listen to the sector and find out what from them is the most useful. Now my other complaint, and I'm going to get a little bit political here, is that frankly, you know, what I'm hearing from some of the other parties is that they're very interested in this and they're very keen on you know, hitting these targets and whatnot. But we've always had targets in Canada, and we have never met them. So it is also that next step of making sure that regardless of what we say in our election platforms and our campaigns, that we actually follow through and meet those targets that we set for ourselves. And that holds true to the sector as well. You know, the sector needs to set targets and meet those targets, and they need to be supported to do that, because of course we know there are costs in that transition, there are costs in changing the way that we do things, and they need to be supported to do that.
Vous pensez donc qu'il y a un peu d'hypocrisie de la part du gouvernement?
And we know also that the Liberal government is being a hypocrite on that, on the fact that, you know, they're saying that their goals are reached, but they're not really in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, we have the highest G7, you know, we're highest in the G7 for our carbon output. We've not met any of our targets. We're still subsidizing oil and gas. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We need as government, or as, you know, parliamentarians, we need to walk the walk as well. Listen, I feel like I'm at the end and I'm taking pock shots, but we have a party that doesn't even acknowledge climate change is real through and through. So that's a bigger problem. And then we have a government that hasn't met their climate targets and talks but doesn't walk. You know I'm in a very privileged position, because the NDP have never been government, so we have never been held to our record. That said, as opposition, my role is to poke a little bit at the failures of some of my colleagues, I think. So I hope they forgive me.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for tonight.